It's hard to believe, but it's 5 years now since the UK was plunged into lockdown for the first time during the COVID-19 pandemic. Something which massively disrupted all our lives in one way or another. In this video, I'm visiting a spot for a camp on one of Loch Lomond's various islands, which represents a significant moment in my experience of the lockdown, and discuss the extremely difficult time I had with feeling trapped during the pandemic and cut off from so many wild places which were important in regulating my mental health, and how I eventually recovered.
My name's Feargus, and this is the middle of nowhere. Welcome back to Scotland if you've been watching my videos. I'm back from the desert and back into the cold, approaching springtime, except all of the trees. It's not quite here yet. Trees don't have their leaves on them yet. This is Loch Island, which is the most northerly of the large islands on Loch Lomond. Loch Lomond is a place that I've been to quite a few times, but not for a while. I've tended to drift away from it because despite the fact that it's beautiful, it tends to get really, really busy and really loud, and that takes away the kind of peaceful atmosphere that I tend to look for when I go wild camping. But at this time of year, it's pretty quiet as it ever gets. And this island is somewhere that I've been before at one of the hardest times in my whole life, during one of the hardest times in many people's lives, in fact, as indicated by the title that you saw on the video. I'm not going to talk about that yet. Right now, I'm going to set up my camp and my creature comforts, and then I'm going to go for a walk around and talk a little bit about the island. And we'll get on to the more profound and deeper topics later on. All right. Camp established, had a little snack. Let's go and have a look around. It's nice that the winter nights have subsided now, so there's actually a little bit of time rather than rushing around to get camp set up and then quickly dive into your tent before dark comes. It's a real relief. As I said, there are multiple fairly large islands on Loch Lomond, and they're all largely covered in woodland. This one is quite unique in that it's dotted around with yew trees. The others are your typical broad-leafed oak beech birch forests on the other islands, but these yews are a big standout on this, the least visited of the islands by people with kayaks and tents and stuff. And legend has it that these trees were planted by Robert the Bruce in the 1300s because they were particularly good, the wood, for making longbows to fight the English. So yeah, there's yew trees dotted about the place, and where they are, it tends to be more open. There's not so many other trees, although there are some young trees here. I can't tell what they are. I think they're birches based on, yeah, those are birch leaves. And down around where I'm camping is oak and beech. Nice spot. Hear the geese? There are wild geese around the shore. Let's go to the top. Okay, one of the summits on the island. I'm not sure if it's the highest, because the ones that I can see to either side look roughly the same size. But there's a lovely view off towards the northern end of the loch. Loch Lomond is fairly shallow at its southern wider end, and then it gets narrower and narrower until it turns into a really deep section in the northern end. So that's why you get the islands popping up in the wider, shallower southern part, and then the waters are deep and dark towards the north, where the glacier which created the loch would have been coming down from the Trossachs back during the Ice Age. It's also, Loch Lomond, the largest freshwater lake on the island of Great Britain. So this is as big as it gets, and the most popular in Scotland. Understandably, the views are great. There's Ben Lomond, the most popular Munro in Scotland, and beyond you've got more Munros. I can't remember what they are. They're in the Trossachs. It's nice to hear the bird song. It was just as peaceful as this the last time I was here. But I'll get back to that in a little while. So, as I said, Loch Lomond is a lot busier than most of the places that I normally go to, but it's fairly quiet at this time of year. But in terms of middle of nowhere-ish-y, this is probably less middle of nowhere than most of the stuff that I do. Yes, this is essentially a wilderness for the most part on the island, but there is a little privately owned house in the middle of the island, and the same is true of most of the other bigger islands. But that's not what I want to focus on in this one. As I said in the introduction, today, the day that this video is going out, marks exactly 5 years since the UK entered the first lockdown of the COVID pandemic. It was a difficult time for everyone. I was having a really hard time even before that happened. This place and this very spot played a small role in my story of difficulties through that time, but I'll get onto that after I've discussed the beginning of the lockdown beforehand. I do want to give a trigger warning. In this part of the video, I'm going to be discussing themes which might not be suitable for certain people, especially younger people. I'm going to be discussing severe mental health issues. I'm going to be talking about ideas around suicide. And I think it's very important for those things to come out into the public sphere and to destigmatize them. And that's why I'm doing it. But some people might want to skip this bit. So I'm going to read you something. I used to write a blog from time to time when I was traveling and going out on micro adventures like this. And this was a blog which I wrote in the heat of the moment following quite a anxiety-inducing experience pretty early on in that first lockdown. And I think it's still just as relevant today. Living with chronic stress, depression, and frequent anxiety attacks has become the norm for me over the last few years, and indeed for most of my adult life. I've had a hard time adjusting to the added responsibility of parenthood since the birth of my son in 2016, and the associated reduction in personal space and time that comes with the role. The one release I've always prioritized was in the wild outdoors. Growing up in the mountains in Ireland with a troubled family and being regularly bullied in school, I always had the option to escape to the hills, the woods, and the streams. Nature was without judgment. No one ever challenged me for being there. It was and always has been my safe space. Numerous courses of therapy have helped me to an extent in dealing with the underlying traumas of childhood that have led me to be socially anxious and have a pathological fear of confrontation. Since 2018, I've been in a particularly bad patch, though to a certain extent, by mid-March this year, I had made some progress out of it. Then the lockdown came. Suddenly, our 3-year-old was home all the time, demanding attention. My wife and I needed to work from home, and it didn't take long before the pills were coming out every day. The small amount of space and time I had while my wife and son were out from Monday to Thursday was gone. Working at home became impossible, and with depression sucking almost all the pleasure out of everything, the days quickly became about getting from the start to the end. Living in a Cornish town, I would go for walks around the local housing estates or the nearby reservoir. But, like getting in between a hippo and the water, I felt trapped, cut off from the open spaces just a little further afield. Yesterday, my wife pointed out that certain groups with health conditions, including mental health, had been out. And I decided, okay, I would go for a walk on the north coast of Cornwall. I took several documents proving I had a mental health condition, just in case I ran into any police. I parked up in a lay-by next to one of the numerous blocked-off National Trust car parks near St. Agnes and made my way up the hill. On the way, I made ample social distancing space for some other walkers next to the cliff. One of them said, "Don't jump," jokingly. I smiled half-heartedly. If only they knew how I was feeling. It was a good walk, though, relatively speaking. In the throes of clinical depression, good means feeling less shit than usual. After a while, I left the trail and descended towards the sea, where I could have some seclusion. I sat down and soaked up the sun, watching the gulls ascending on the updrafts for an hour. I felt calmer than I have in days. Pleased with myself for being able to moderate my mood a little without pills, I made my way back to the car. As I was pulling out, a cyclist was on his way up the steep, narrow road, so I waited to let him pass. But pretty soon it was clear he wasn't going to. He took out his headphones from his ears and began to challenge me for having driven to the beach, stating that the guidelines were clear, that no one was to drive for exercise, and quickly moved on to telling me that I was a dick and that people like me made him sick. Already well out of my hard-won calm, I replied that this was a very quiet area and I had stayed well away from others, which according to the experts was the only strategy that really made a difference. He said it didn't matter. and that I was being selfish and decided to take a picture of me in my car on his phone, which he intended to post on social media for shaming. After that, my language got more loaded. I asked him if he'd ever known what it's like not to care if he's alive or dead. "Nah, mate," the reply came back as he continued to take the picture. I carried on trying to point out, though not in polite terms by now, that the rules and guidelines were marginalizing certain people, and that some were having a particularly hard time dealing with the situation, which he again dismissed. After exchanging some final abusive language, he cycled off down the track where I'd been walking, and I drove home to take another diazepam. I hadn't felt more depressed, anxious, and suicidal in months. COVID-19 is serious, and I agree with most of the lockdown measures in place, and I wouldn't think for a second to flout the guidelines because I'm bored or simply frustrated. But I'm one of around 10 million people in the UK with a mental health condition at any one time, a number predicted to rise significantly as a result of the current crisis. And in fact, it did rise a lot. I've become accustomed to being ignored by society, as until someone has been through it, it's very difficult to relate to. It's an inconvenience for most, something they don't want to hear about, so we withdraw and lie when people ask how we are. We avoid stressful situations, and our lives unravel because of the social pressure to be in good form. Ignorance is something I've learned to live with. At least I had the outdoors, my relatively safe space. But times are different now. Now, the invisibility of mental health is a liability. The morality police are out in force, determined to be right without considering the state of the person they verbally attack. The lockdown has been necessary for two reasons: to reduce deaths and to slow the spread of the outbreak to a speed that the NHS can accommodate. But the crisis, including the lockdown imposed to handle it, is already leading to a slower burning global psychological catastrophe, to say nothing of the level of stress that the economic downturn of all of this will cause. I've been on the waiting list for 4 months for NHS-funded counselling on a critically underfunded division of the health service even before this kicked off. And those for whom these symptoms are new need more urgent care because they have yet to develop coping mechanisms. Every time I go out locally, I see people flouting the guidelines. Whether it be teenagers hanging out with their skateboards or adults meeting up to exercise together, I haven't been within 2 meters of another human being, at least not intentionally, in nearly a month. Yet I am a dick. A COVIDiot, if you like, having broken the rules. The shaming that is taking place around this crisis is a disgrace, and some people find it harder than others to endure, to the point where life no longer seems worth living. If millions of people lose the will to live, to allow thousands who do to survive, I am not belittling the tragic deaths that are happening and have every sympathy for the victims, then this is a serious moral dilemma. It's not black and white. But shaming and verbally abusing people who just want a bit of space, minding their own business, is shameful. When directed at someone in a serious personal crisis, it only serves to reinforce the long-term feeling that society doesn't give a shit about their problems and they should just get out of the way. I get a bit emotional reading that. Why am I reading this now? Why am I telling you this now? Because I think some people didn't have a big problem getting through lockdowns. They were bored, they were frustrated. Some people had a very hard time getting on with the people that they were living with. Other people were getting extremely lonely, and that was a real problem. And some people were really, really suffering. Obviously, I was going through a really hard time. I've been in and out of depression throughout my adult life, and that was the most severe period in terms of the intensity, if you stretch it out, over the several years that it lasted to come out of it. And it would be another 2 years before I began to emerge out of it. A lot of people's needs were sidelined because of this sudden need to lock down. The people making the rules were evidently, at least for the most part, not the kind of people who would even consider that people might react in a really severe way to being curtailed like that. It was an inconvenience for the people in power deciding these things, whereas a lot of people had a much, much harder time. I was relatively lucky in terms of I was living in a small village and I could walk to places with some woodland, for example, within 10 minutes of the door. But on that day and on some other days after that, when people did get a little bit more relaxed, I just felt desperate. I felt desperately in need of getting to a place where I could look to the horizon. And I didn't have that in the space that I was living. Plus, the main nature trail, which was in close walking distance, I just got sick and tired of all the dog shit. People were just leaving it everywhere. My 3-year-old son, he was 3 at the time, kept standing in it, and then we would have to bring him back and clean his shoes. It was absolutely infuriating. But the truth is, the lockdown couldn't have hit me at a much worse time in my life. It had been so difficult over the previous few years, and this light at the end of the tunnel that I was working hard to come out of that period was just shut down, closed off, and I just had to endure. And if anybody has been through severe depression, chronic stress, then they will understand it much better than people who haven't. But it's a bit like, imagine you were walking around a corner and someone jumps out in front of you with a knife. You would get a sudden surge of adrenaline and terror. Imagine if that doesn't go away, if that just carries on throughout the day in, day out. It wasn't as bad as that initial kind of peak of terror, but it was a lower level and it just didn't go away. It ruins your sleep, it saps your energy, and then the depression, of course, means that everything metaphorically is in grayscale. You look around and there's just no emotional color to the world. You don't care. You see something you love, you don't care. You see something you hate, you don't care. And without that emotion, you lose motivation. Motivation is what gets us to get up in the morning. It's what gets us to go to work. It's what gets us to keep going. And without that, you just don't care. It just doesn't feel worth it. So ultimately, it was moving to Scotland that made all the difference. Initially, we lived for a year in Clackmannanshire, which is just to the east of Stirling. And it didn't matter where I wandered in that year, even during the second lockdown in the winter, I was never confronted. In fact, people were very friendly. And gradually, over that year, and then after that, when we moved up to the Highlands, things eased off and I was comfortable in nature again. But there's one other thing that I want to read, which takes us to this place about a year later. I keep a daily diary, and this is an entry from Tuesday, April the 13th, 2021. Sturgeon, that's Nicola Sturgeon, announced today that we'll be allowed out of our council areas on day trips officially from Friday, 10 days earlier than planned. And it's been a bit of a boost. Aoife, my wife, is coming up with plans to go to the beach at the weekend. I'm off tomorrow to camp on one of the Loch Lomond islands for a couple of nights. Something that's not allowed, but I'd been planning before today's announcement. I'm looking forward to it, surprisingly. I thought I was too frazzled to get excited like this. The next day, I'm sitting in our comfy camping chair on Inch Luneg Island on Loch Lomond, watching the last light fade on the hills opposite. It was very much a moment just like right now. In the past, I would have been running around taking pictures under the circumstances, but now I just don't have the drive, and I'm so spaced out and dissociated. Still, I know it's beautiful, and the part of me that's desperate for peace and space appreciate it. I can still hear the main road loud and clear, even though it's a couple of miles away, but lockdown seems to be the ideal time to be on Loch Lomond, with few motorboats and no tourist ferries or jet skis. I think the geese are breeding as they keep displaying to each other and making a lot of noise. This is the first night I've spent alone in 6 months, and it feels like it in terms of how burned out my nerves and brain are. Later on, still sitting out in the chair at 9:30 in the late twilight, I just noticed something swimming in the loch below me and turned on the torch and saw an otter. It just cruised past for a few meters, with the torchlight reflecting back at me like cat's eyes before diving. I've never had such a good view before of a native otter. And then I wrote in my diary the next day, I slept reasonably well in the tent after sitting out until well after dark. It took me some time this morning to get going, and I eventually had to kick myself up the arse to explore the island for a bit. It was lovely, although I felt bad for giving a couple of breeding geese a scare. I think the best thing about the time on the island was just doing nothing whatsoever, with no one around to interrupt it. As people who watch my videos regularly can see, I do spend numerous days and nights away from my family alone every month. And that's how I decompress. So having been locked in the house with my wife and son, who I adore, I'm not going to say that that is somehow a punishment, but I do need that other side in order to regulate my nerves. After 6 months of that, it made a massive difference coming out here, as I wrote. I feel very, very strongly that people being able to come out and access nature and feeling that they can and they won't be judged for it can be extremely helpful. There are an increasing number of studies which show that, and I would certainly recommend it to anybody who hasn't tried it. It doesn't have to be the kind of things which I am doing. Obviously, it can be something as simple as going for a walk in the woods. What's your lockdown story? Did you struggle through it? Did you have access to the outdoors, or were you confronted? Did you feel welcome? Did it feel like it was okay to get what you needed from nature at that time? I'd love to hear that. So let me know in the comments if you fancy it. So that's the end of that section. Young people can come back in now. I am going to do my best to move on, and I have moved on from that period. Clear my head, enjoy the silence. I'm a bit bunged up because I have a head cold, and I'm going to eat some dinner and enjoy my evening. I've got to leave pretty early tomorrow in order to drive back home to the northwest. But for tonight, I can take my time. Morning. Those Canada geese have been going all night, making a hell of a racket. There were none of them here when I paddled in yesterday. It seems to be over territory with breeding pairs dotted about, honking at each other when they get too close to the other one's claim and then chasing them around. From what I can hear though, most of them seem to be in the woods on the other side. I'm just jumping in here quickly to say thanks for watching the video. If you're new to my videos, maybe consider having a look at some of the older stuff that I've done. There's over 50 videos up on my channel now, some of which are covering similar content to this, and some of which are quite different, but all of them are somewhere out in the middle of nowhere. I'm passionate about making these journeys and about sharing them with you, and it's your watching that makes it all worthwhile. If you're not subscribed already to the channel, hit the subscribe button below. I'd appreciate that. And if you know anybody who might be into this kind of content, why not share a link to this video with them or to the channel in general? I'm hoping to be able to make this content in perpetuity, and making it financially sustaining is going to make that much more likely. So if you're a regular viewer and you can afford it, please consider making a small donation of a couple of quid via the Buy Me a Coffee link in the description below. I'm not into paywalls, so there won't be any exclusive content for those who do donate, but it would be much appreciated. Thanks a lot. Right, I hope this hasn't been too much of a downer of a video, but as I said, I feel like it's important to share and break the stigma, because I know how validating it can be for people who do have mental health issues to hear openness from others, and it will encourage them to be more open and not feel like they have to hide it. I gotta get on the water because I've got a long drive ahead of me. I'm gonna leave this spot to the bickering geese and drive back to the northwest. It'll be a couple of weeks now because it was a short gap, only 1 week between the last video and this one. So I'm gonna leave a slightly longer gap between this one and the next one. Spring is coming. Probably won't be here for the next video quite yet, but I'm really looking forward to it. Make sure to subscribe, give it a thumbs up, and share. See you later.